My wife and I are very happy to be here. We want to get right into the testimony. Our plan, as far as we know, is for each of us to give the testimony from our perspective. So we'll be going back and forth, trying to give you a sense of what was going on inside of our minds, inside of our hearts, through the whole process. It was about 5 years ago when each of us believed for the first time, believed on Jesus, believed the gospel. And so there's many, many events in our lives leading up to that point. We're going to start before that point and try to give you a sense of some of the things that were going on in our lives, how we got into sin in the first place, and then how the Lord brought us out. And some of the topics that we'll be touching on are very serious, very upsetting to us anyway. But we've decided that it's important to talk about these things in the open. The Bible talks about them very frankly. So our plan is to do the same. And my wife is going to start. Let's go ahead, Kristy.
Is this on? Okay. Hi. So when we pulled up here today, I saw the billboard. Is that what it's called? The thing out there that says what's happening, and it said former lesbian white witch. And I said to my husband, I think that's me. It was kind of shocking, actually. But I thought we'll take a picture of it, just for the record, for my resume. Because it's hard to believe, but now I am a spirit-filled, blood-bought daughter of Jesus Christ. So I actually grew up in the church, and very much so because my dad was a minister of music at various churches, and my mom also helped with the music in churches. And we moved around a lot. I grew up in the South, and we landed here in Tennessee when I was about 8. So we worked at a lot of different churches, and I said a sinner's prayer when I was a kid, and I don't remember exactly when, and I was baptized, and I even shared the gospel such as I understood it. I talked about Jesus and to people, but looking back now, I don't think I was saved, knowing the road that I've walked. I think that I had an intellectual understanding of who Jesus was and the gospel message, but I didn't understand how it pertained to me or my need for it. I think I didn't really believe with Jesus in my house. My parents were very divided. It was just a struggle. It may be in some of your houses or people in your families. It was just a struggle, and I didn't have that sense of a tribe and belonging in my house. And of course, I was very up close to seeing hypocrisy because of my dad's role in the church and what was actually going on in secret. We moved a lot, as I said, so I was going to a different school almost every year. So I didn't have a sense of tribe there either. I felt very isolated and alone in the world. And each school I would go to, I would end up befriending like one girl there and have a really close emotional bond. And she would kind of feel like my source of just communion. And this happened time and time again. So by the time I hit college, then the first night that we were there, the LGBT, which stood for the lesbian, gay, bisexual community, had a representative come to our dorm floor to talk to us. Now, my family, my church, no one had ever talked explicitly about homosexuality. I can honestly say inside me, I knew that was wrong. But no one had said it. But somehow I just instinctively knew that wasn't right because it wasn't something the people that I respected were doing. And maybe it's the Spirit of God just talking to me. I knew that wasn't right, but I was introduced to these people, and they seemed like really nice people, nice and friendly and welcoming. And And over time, that's how I was introduced to him right away. So the next thing that happened is I was introduced to feminism. So again, this was not anything that I had been grown up with, the whole idea. And very shortly, I was introduced to these ideas that men were really awful and that they had oppressed us women in multiple ways. And I began to see that and agree with that. And by the sophomore year of my college experience, I was starting to be more and more pulled toward the lesbian community. And there was actually a moment where it was an actual particular moment, and I remember thinking, I really want to go for and explore this part of my sexuality. But I know that Jesus is not okay with that, and so it's got to be one or the other. And I thought, well, I'm just going to experiment a little bit. I'm just going to try this out a little bit, and then a little while later, I'm going to come back to Jesus after I got to sow my wild oats. And that didn't happen for the next 17 years. I started to explore it, and I fully got involved with that community and just embraced that identity. Now, I came out as a lesbian. I also would sometimes call myself bisexual or queer. That was a trendy term that we had embraced as a positive term, and I just fully embraced that community, immersed myself in it. I will say to you even that my parents, when they figured this out when I was just turned or about to turn 18, and they found that I had gotten involved, they took me to a therapist to try to help straighten it out, and she totally supported me and was analyzing their problems to me. So going to her affirmed what I was already into. And so I spent the next 17 years involved in that community and in that identity one way or another. And the other piece, as I was saying, in my household, it felt so disheveled and no sense of tribe. And so the other thing that drew me, and this started in high school, was the occult. And I got just involved in like different books and stuff, things that I thought were cool, like tarot cards, fortune telling. Oh, that seemed fun to try to see the future, and things like that. It just seemed harmless, like kind of harmless and interesting, fun. But it also seemed to promise like a sense of power, like I could change something if I could learn to do spells. And it seemed to provide also a sense of mystery and depth, like a spiritual depth, I thought, that I didn't feel was in my church community. To me, church seemed kind of vacuous and kind of empty. And people seemed really what I thought of as mainstream. See, I thought of myself as kind of special and eccentric. And I liked that, and I wanted to embrace that because I felt rejected anyway, that I didn't fit in. So I got involved in these different, just reading occult books and experimenting. And then when I hit college, they had a druid group, people that were going out in the woods and lighting a bonfire and running around, and I got involved in that. And somewhere shortly after that, I was, again, reading some books about this, and I read about witch. Oh, a witch, that's just somebody who loves and worships nature. It's not really like what you see in the movies, somebody casting evil spells and messing with dead animals and stuff like that. It's really something kind of beautiful and magical. And I thought, well, I love nature, so that's who I am. And so I just fully embraced that. At various times, I called myself a witch or a pagan or different related identities like that. But for about a couple decades, I was fully immersed in these two identities as a queer witch or pagan. And that was all the way up till about 5.5 years ago, as my husband said. And you'll get to hear what brought me out of that a little bit later.
My experience growing up in Massachusetts is there's a little bit cultural difference. Here, when you drive 10, 15 miles, you drive by 4, 5, 6, or 7 Baptist churches. Where I live, it's Catholic churches. And every town you come into, you're going by the Polish Catholic Church, the regular kind of American Catholic Church, the Spanish Catholic Church. So that's kind of a baseline culture where I am. It's not the only religious expression, but it's very strong. And I was raised in the Roman Catholic faith. And I was raised with a few good ideas. I never doubted as a young person, as a child and early teenage years. I always understood that there was one creator God, that the creator was moral, that he had a moral expectation of me, that he expected me to do good and to do right. And I wanted to as a child, and I was completely involved in my church, in my experience in the Roman Catholic faith. Anything that was available to do, I did it. And as I entered into my teenage years, like 13, 14, 15, I started to recognize my own sinfulness. I started to recognize things from the church that were being preached against that I did, wanted to do, was doing, and this was very troubling to me, because what I had been taught was that when you sin, you need to confess that sin, not to God, to a priest. And the priest would then give you an assignment, something to do as a penance. It was usually prayers. It was usually memorized prayers. Sometimes it was the Lord's Prayer. Very often it was the Hail Mary prayer. So if I had a sin that was troubling me, and I understood that if I sinned, I would go to hell. That was on my mind as a young person. So I would go to the priest and to get something to take this sin away from me so I wouldn't go to hell. So then I'd be on my knees praying to the Virgin Mary with the understanding that once I did that, that particular sin would be removed. So I did that. I did this religious activity, trying to find peace with God for the things that I had done that I knew were wrong. And I did not find peace that way. At the same time, I started to recognize, similar to what my wife was saying, the hypocrisy of my parents and the hypocrisy of the church community that I was in, that there was things being said on Sunday, being preached, saying you must do this, and then the people, the adults in my life weren't actually doing those things. And that put me in quite a crisis, because I was suddenly recognizing my own damnation, the fact that I was sending myself to hell through my sins. And the people that were around me, I didn't feel like there was anybody I could actually discuss it with, because they weren't actually doing what they said you needed to do to avoid going to hell. And also at that same time, right about 16, I started to feel like basically just the sexual pressure coming up in my body, just that experience of coming into a sexual maturity. So I was interested in girls, and I started dating. I didn't have any adults I could talk about with these things. And the first girl I dated had been raised in basically a New Age experience. Her parents were divorced. Her mom was into many of the kinds of things that Kristalyn was talking about, things that would all fall in the category of the occult, or in the Bible language, witchcraft. Searching for spiritual power that was not coming from God the Creator, that was coming from other sources. In fact, I mean, when you say the occult, it embodies a huge collection of ideas. Many of them are contradictory to each other, but they all agree that the Bible is wrong. That's the one thing that they all have in common. Everything that they're offering is coming from another source, either a different God, or they've exchanged God entirely, that the Creator isn't a person, isn't moral, is like a force and an energy that you can cultivate. And that's what a lot of meditation is about. So as a 16-year-old, I was basically exiting the Catholic Church and getting my spiritual counsel from a 15-year-old girl who had been raised practicing witchcraft. And going forward, another 17 years, every woman that I dated and got involved with was also into witchcraft. I never was seeking witchcraft. I was just seeking relief from the pressure in my mind, the guilt that I had, and also basically, just natural sexuality. I was interested in girls. I wanted a wife. I wanted to date. And so this actually just created a little path, and every step I took was deeper into the occult, deeper into sexual sin, because that's part of the values of most of what's offered in the occult is opposite of the Bible. It's really the values that I was exposed to were really more about sexual expression, sexual freedom, not being bound by the conventions of society. They viewed the Bible and the church as holding people back from the good things in life. So this was the path that basically took me to where I met my wife in Vermont in 2007, where both of us were not just practicing witchcraft, but we were teaching witchcraft. That's what we were doing when we met. Each of us had been hired, in a sense, at this camp for adults to learn witchcraft, and we had gotten so involved in it that we had become the teachers. You want to pick up there?
Yeah, so as I said, I was primarily involved in relationships with women for almost 2 decades. But at that same time, I can tell you that while this started out on a real high, and I fully embraced it, and I loved my community, and I loved my identity, and the same with the witchcraft, but I was a fallen human being, and I ended up having troubles in my relationships. Not things I would discuss with my parents, because I wouldn't want them to think they could get any wedge in there, but things that really plagued me. And I had other issues with my sexuality. There was a fundamental hole, emptiness in me, a lack of understanding my worth, because I didn't know who I was, what I was created to be. And so I sought out that sense of meaning and worth in my sexuality, and it became a real compulsion for me, not just the identity, the lesbian identity, but sex itself, even in my relationships. And it made for a lot of misery and struggle. I started doing a lot of going to various therapists and healing modalities, because I could sense that something was wrong, that I couldn't fully admit it, but I knew something was wrong. I thought maybe it was my partners, that they were the problem, but I could also sense that something was not right in me, that I had this constant need to have my worth and my sense of meaning and my sense of being loved affirmed by other people, and primarily through my sexuality. So I had hours and hours of therapy and, like I said, various healing modalities, New Age and pagan, occult type of healing modalities. I spent literally thousands of dollars on this and hours of my time, and I did not see much progress. So I did also feel attraction to men, but I had decided in my head that I just could never be with one long term, that I would end up unhappy. A man would not understand me. I wouldn't be emotionally met. And so I didn't feel I could pursue that. But after so many years of misery in the queer community and in those kind of relationships, I got to a point where I was like, okay, if I could just find a person who could meet me at all, I would be happy. I wouldn't worry about what their gender was kind of my thought. And so in 2007, as Daniel said, we met at a witch camp teaching witchcraft. And I had literally 2 weeks ago ended a 9-year relationship with a woman. So I met 2 weeks before that. I don't know what I said. 2 weeks before I met him, I just ended this 9-year relationship that was quite a struggle. But it was also, looking back, it was like an addiction. I felt like I loved this person, and I couldn't get out of it, even though I was miserable. My family just had no idea of the struggles I was going through, but it was very painful. So I met him in 2007, and I was just open at that time to anything. And I do believe that this was a move of God, even though we met teaching at a witch camp, but God does make good things out of really ugly situations. And my family had been relentlessly praying for me on all accounts, primarily praying for my salvation, but also praying that my relationships would be rectified, that I'd be able to find a godly man to share my life with. And so I do believe that God brought us together, because I don't know if there's any other man that could have broke through what I was in at that time. So we got married in 2008, a little over a year after that, and that was wonderful. I loved Daniel. We had a great relationship from the beginning. It didn't heal, though, the whole compulsion, the deep need. It felt like it might for a little bit, but then the chemicals wore down and life carried on, and the brokenness was still there. So I found myself acting out even on our relationship, still having compulsive needs around my sexuality, and even to the point where I did get a very strong crush, if you want to call it that, on another woman, a good friend of mine, which was nothing ever came of it on a physical level, but it shook our relationship, the sense of just what's happening here. That was in 2012. So this was about a year before we were saved. So about 2012, I think, is about a year before we were saved, I really feel like God started to deal with me. Or maybe I just started being able to hear him. I'm not really sure. It was like, that year was like one thing after another. It was like one failure in my life after another. And it was so painful. I just started to have the feeling like, is there anything true in this world? My pagan community that I was so in love with, my whole life revolved around my spirituality. I started to be disappointed by them. I started to see that, I started to see the hypocrisy there, and the reality that everybody was completely self-absorbed, and including me. And I was like, does anybody even interested in me? Does anybody want to know who I am for myself? And it was extremely painful and dark. And there were several things that God did to get my attention. I don't have time to go into each of them, but let me put it this way. So at the one hand, I was just falling apart. Things were failing, literally, in my life. Every project, thing that I would set out to do would fail, and I was getting more and more depressed in myself, and not telling my husband that I was starting to doubt our whole religious thing, where I was going. It just had a collection of often conflicting ideas that we tried to bring together in some way that never really worked, so I never had that security. So all of these things came together in the spring of 2013. God made another move. My husband got a job playing organ at a church. This was not a thing that should have happened, I can say. It happened because the person who did the hiring wasn't really a believer. That person had a religious relationship with the organ, and she wanted that organ played well. So It's the truth. I'm sorry to say this was a split church. But the pastor was a true man of God. And praise the Lord for him, because he's another person that the Lord worked through. And so he started playing organ at this church, and I started going with him because I didn't feel comfortable with him going to this church by himself. I wanted to protect him and make sure he didn't get any funny ideas in his head. So I started going with him, and I was certain I was going to be bored senseless by the sermons, so I felt like I had to have something to entertain me. And I thought, well, the only thing that's really appropriate, I guess, is a Bible. If I try to bring a comic book in there or a magazine or something, I'm gonna blow his job. So I had a Bible that I had gotten from my grandfather. I'd asked for it, and I put it on my ancestor altar to worship my ancestors. I thought it was my spiritual connection to him. But I grabbed that Bible, I took it to church, and and then I had a thought. I'm going to read this. I'm just going to open this up. I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to read it. I'm going to see if there's anything good in here. And if there is, I'm just going to take it. And if there's nothing, I'm just going to throw this away, and I'm never going to think about Christianity again. And so I started reading right in Genesis, and I got confused really quickly. I did not know what was going on. Well, why is God doing this? Why is he doing that? This is really weird stuff. But I kind of kept up with it. Then one Sunday after we'd been there for a little while, we went in before the service, and I was just sitting in my pew and waiting for the service to begin. Daniel's up at the organ, and the pastor was behind the pulpit on his knees praying. And I thought, well, he seems like a really spiritual man. And I'm looking in the Bible, and I suddenly hear this song in my head, and it was like from 30 years ago, something I had heard in church and not thought about or remembered since then, and it just pops in my head. And it goes, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. And the pastor got up to start the service, and he opened the whole thing. He said, we're going to start with a Bible verse. And he read that Bible verse. And I was sitting in my seat. I was convicted or something. I was seen. I felt like, whoa, what is happening? Who is God onto me? I just knew something was going on. And I went home that day. I don't think I told Daniel right away what had happened, but I was like, okay, I got to figure this out. So something's going on here. I got online, and I just typed in some about Jesus, whatever, and ended up on this video by Ravi Zacharias called Jesus Among Other Gods. So this is a video aimed at people in worshiping other gods, which I did. And I'm listening. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we get toward the end, and he starts talking about John chapter 14. And again, and there was like this zing in my spirit. Oh, John chapter 14. That's where I need to go. So I open John 14, and I see I'm going to paraphrase, but no, I'm not there yet. Be not troubled. He's saying, be not troubled. He's saying, my peace I will give you. Not like, what is it? Not like the peace that the world gives you, but my peace. And it just touched me so deeply. I was like, I didn't know what it's about, who he's talking to, what he's talking about, but I'm like, I want that peace. That's what I need. And so I just keep reading down. And then I hit this verse. Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And again, at that moment, I just had this, it was really like a fear, actually. I was like, wow, this is so clear. And I can tell you before, I just really had written Jesus off as like mythology, like all the other gods. So I just thought, oh, he's just, this is another story, yada, 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 just like everything else. But I was like, well, wow, he's making a really big claim here. So he's like not saying I am a way or a truth or a life. I am the way, the truth, the life. And that's it. So I was like, okay, there's a line. It's him or everything else. So I've really got to figure this out. So I spent the next week, and I wasn't working at that time. I literally just threw myself into studying, and nobody knew this, well, except my husband. Nobody knew that this was happening. I was just reading, I don't even know what, maybe some apologetics, just anything I could get my hands on. I was listening to testimonies, people talking about heaven and hell and experiences they'd had, dying and coming back to life, and it just went on this way to the point where my husband and I were starting to like quarrel and stuff, and he's saying, don't you want to step back from the videos, get off the internet? And I'm like, no, I've got to figure this out. And by the end of the week, I just suddenly, it's like it just was a revelation. I realized this Jesus is real. He is who he says he is. I didn't even fully know what that was. I didn't realize what a sinner I was, people. I had no clue. I just knew he's right, I'm wrong. This is serious. I am in a lot of trouble, and I need to get on his side like right away. That's really, it was just like, this is a very serious business. And I was in the bathroom actually, and I just fell on my knees. And I didn't know what to say, so I was just like, Jesus, I'm wrong. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I've been doing. Just help me. Show me what to do, and I will follow you. And you just lead me. And that's it. And I stood up from there. And I know this doesn't necessarily happen this way for everybody, but for me, the compulsion, the sexual issue I've been dealing with that I was telling you about, it changed instantly in that moment, and to this day, permanently, completely. He healed me. He cleaned it up. He showed me what he did. He showed me who I was in him, and it was like I don't have to get that from another person or a group, because God made me just to be there, be in him, and that gives me all the worth that I ever need. So whatever happens in life, I know who I am, and what I need to do is just turn to him. And it healed me. And and this experience, my husband, he saw this right away. And that is what got his complete attention.
So, as I said earlier, we're trying to give you a picture of our inner experience. And because I know that many of you or all of you know people that are living lives like what our lives were like. The thing about our experience in religious paganism and related belief systems is that the promises of those experiences and that faith tradition and that magic, that witchcraft, the promises are all up front. It's like you sign on to it before you get the benefits. That's how it works with like Eastern meditation. People, and I was one of those. There was a period of my life where I meditated, not looking at scripture, like lying in my bed, trying to control my mind, organize the thoughts in my mind in such a way that I would tap in to some kind of force, some kind of spiritual energy that was available to those that trained themselves or signed on to some tradition. It was the same in our witchcraft. When you first get involved in witchcraft, you don't know that much. So there's all these classes to take, and they all cost money. And so you're kind of climbing this ladder, and you come in with with burdens, addictions, doubts, insecurities, and you're trying to get your needs met, but you're working for it. There's a price for everything. Just like if you want to take a yoga class, you have to pay first. You don't get the benefit of any of the Eastern traditions that I know of, yoga being one of them. You don't get the benefit at the beginning. You get it at the end, after you've poured all this money and time. And so we, as professional, I wasn't really quite professional. My wife was a professional witch. She has been paid to get on airplanes and go to other parts of the country, go to Canada, to teach people witchcraft. So I was just kind of getting into that. She was ahead of me. So what I'm trying to show is that we had a front. We were presenting ourselves to our peers as having something valuable, that we had found the peace and the freedom from our addictions, and that we were living in joy and opulence. You know, a major theme of occultic traditions is attracting wealth, the power of attraction. And these are occultic things. This is not scriptural in any way. That you can, in yourself, attract wealth. Not by working hard. Not by getting a good job. Not by getting training. Not by studying the market. By lying in your bed or sitting in a position and meditating and tapping into spiritual energy or even actual spirits. Devil spirits are available to help people get these things. So we were trying to teach people to do this so they could be happy and fulfilled like us, but secretly, and even secret to each other. That was not the case. We were very insecure. We never did find the peace. Maybe like a drug habit, we did rituals that were ecstatic, kind of like a rock concert. Like Kristalyn was saying, like a big fire in the woods at night with the stars, dancing, running around, drumming, chanting. There's an element of self-hypnosis. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of beauty. And so you get an experience, you get a rush, you get a relief, like when you take an aspirin. But you wake up the next day and your problems are all still there, and oftentimes they're worse. So this was the experience that we were having, and we were even keeping it from each other, although the cracks were showing. When Kristalyn was saying that everything she attempted was failing, it was because she was a professional witch, and she was presenting things or teaching classes or trying to make connections with other people, networking, and all of that. It never would produce what we wanted it to produce, what we had been taught that it would produce. So this is where we were at when, out of kind of like desperation, I took this organ job at a church because I didn't have any good paying work, and I hadn't attracted all this wealth to myself by meditating. So I said, okay, I've seen that one ad for weeks, and I went to the church, and I could play well enough, and they didn't ask me anything about myself. And so I started playing organ at this church, and like she was saying, she came along, and she became a Christian, which was very sudden. And she told me one day that she had become a Christian, and my first reaction was anger. I was very angry. I didn't recognize Jesus as Jesus of the Bible. My understanding of Jesus was as just another spirit. We were constantly trying to contact spirits. There's thousands of them. The Bible names a whole bunch of them, or describes them anyway. So I just considered Jesus as another spirit that people were contacting, but I didn't much care for what he had to offer. So I was very angry that my wife not only was involved with this guy, but that she was piling up all of her pagan paraphernalia by the door, ostensibly to get rid of it. Like her life had changed, and she hadn't consulted me first. So that made me angry, and I didn't like this Jesus messing with my life in my house, changing my wife without consulting me first. So I was very angry. I was unkind to her. I was brusque, standoffish, rude. But I did see, once she told me that she had become a Christian, I did see changes in her immediately. And she became much more loving. I would have said that we loved each other before then, but it wasn't until experiencing her love as a Christian that I started. I guess I started to understand what love actually was. Up until that point, our love was really just convenience. She appealed to me. She wasn't taller than me. She was very talented musically. We both played music, and there was a lot of ways that we suited each other. She made a good wife for me. She made my life better. Therefore, I loved her like the way you might love Chinese food or something like that. She did something for me, and so I loved her. And here I was being very rude and unkind to her, yet she was loving me and serving me. And that really caught my attention. It put me in this point where then I started, like I said earlier, like putting up this front and telling her, oh, I don't want to hear that Bible, or letting her read to me for a little while and saying, no, forget it, I don't want to hear that. But in my private time, I actually started to read the Bible because I saw my wife transform overnight, and I needed to figure out what is in this book. What is going on? Is this for real? Or is this just another blip on our kind of spiritual roller coaster? It took me about 6 weeks with her witness and with taking time most days privately to read the Bible. I had a moment. There's many little stories along the way. One really strong one. Bible, I dropped it on the bed. It fell open to a passage in Deuteronomy where God is speaking to Israel. And I have it up here. That's why I'm looking. And he's basically telling them, that was it. Oh, never mind. Anyway, he's basically telling them, listen, when I spoke to you the first time, you didn't see anything. You didn't see an image. So don't make images. Don't make statues of men. Don't make statues of fish. Don't make statues of any kind of other god besides me. And that, Kristalyn talked about being convicted reading the book of John. I got very convicted reading the book of Deuteronomy because it in 4 or 5 verses described exactly what our religion was. And here was somebody claiming to be the God, the creator, who we did not know in witchcraft. It was an unanswerable question. We tried to get answers from people ahead of us, more advanced than us. Nobody could explain where the earth came from, who actually initiated it. So here's the God of creation describing himself and saying, this is me, so don't do these things. And it was a moment of clarity where I felt like everything that we had been about was just empty. And eventually I also read the book of John, and having read many books and many other spiritual traditions, I never heard anything that was so clear and so different than what man produces. Jesus, just speaking for himself, just stood out as entirely different. And mine wasn't so clearly articulated like Kristalyn's was in reading in chapter 14. It was more like I took the whole document and I was just convinced by the end that he was God, that only God could have said those things, only God could have done those things, God the Creator. And at some point along there, I became a Christian as well. It wasn't so clear as like, okay, today's the day. But the more that I looked into it, the more that I read, we started actually going to church, not just going to my job, but going to church to learn and to worship God. And at some point that summer, I became a Christian too, and we both knew that we had to get rid of everything. And our house was full of little statues that we used in rituals, full of books, it took a whole summer to get rid of all this stuff that we had accumulated over several decades of occultic lifestyle. You want to tell them?
Oh, and by get rid of, we mean we destroyed it. We didn't give it away. We burnt it. Things that couldn't burn, we crushed to dust as well as we could, and we made sure nobody else would mess with this ever again.
And unlike the traditions I was describing earlier, where you have to work to get the benefits, similar to my wife, in that period where I believed and I started worshiping Jesus, much of the things that I had been struggling with and carrying in my life and burdens, hard to even describe, but my life became lighter. Life had been a drag and a burden and hard work, and just knowing Jesus, not knowing very much Bible, not knowing much at all, just recognizing who he was and believing it changed my life. And I can't describe it in much more detail than that. There was something I wanted to say, it just left. Did you have anything right now? No?
Well, I can say that what changed in him is he also learned to love. My husband was a very isolationist kind of person who really didn't like people very much. Now, nobody knew that he didn't like him, because he was raised to be a good boy and to, meet people's needs, but he didn't want to. He was resentful, and what he wanted more than anything was to have his own little studio in the woods that not even I would be in, where he could go and play his piano for hours at a time and nobody would mess with him. It's true. And all of that went away, though, because he got an interest in people after that, because he wanted to edify the saints, his brothers and sisters, and he wanted to bring life to the dead and bring the truth to sinners. So he came to truly love people and me, and I saw a total change in his personality.
So I think what I'd like to do now is just briefly, I brought a few scriptures with me that I wanted to just discuss for a minute and look at Romans chapter 1, just to help us all reflect on the experience that we've been describing from the Bible. You can stay or run off, whatever you want. So we can look at Romans chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. I'll read it, and then I'll tell you just a little bit about what this means to me and my experience. In this section of Scripture, Paul is explaining why the wrath of God is on people. Why are people living under the wrath of God? And he doesn't start by saying because they haven't heard the gospel. What he says instead is, for the invisible things of him, meaning God, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And that scripture just actually, I think, describes my experience and my wife's experience. As a young man, I understood these things about God. I didn't need the Bible to understand what I said in the beginning, that God, the Creator, is moral and had an expectation of me. I knew that intuitively. And that's true of everybody on the face of the earth. This is knowledge that God has made available. And I say that because we're dealing and interacting with unbelievers every day. At least I am. And sometimes there's a feeling of like, how do I get them to understand these things about God? They're just kind of living their lives, and all they care about is satisfying their needs and their pleasures for the time. How do I communicate who God is to them? But it's important to understand that God already has communicated himself. Who God is obvious from the things that he's made. And that's where I was at 16. I understood who God was, and I was in trouble. I knew that I was under the wrath of God. But not having the right guidance, or maybe not even wanting it at that time, I can't remember, I started to exchange this truth with these occultic ideas that we've been describing. I tried to replace who God was with something else through the witchcraft and the meditation and the Eastern philosophy. I took the truth that I had and I exchanged it. And my wife did the same thing. And which is exactly what the scriptures say. Professing themselves to be wise, in verse 22, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. That's what we did. If you would come to our house, you would have seen the little statues. This is what we did. We took the knowledge that we had of the true God and we tried to replace it so that we could pursue the things that we thought would give us pleasure and satisfaction. Thankfully, in our case, we never actually escaped the true God. None of the things that we tried to take on through our meditations and our chanting and trying to replace our ideas, none of that ever erased the true God. Both of us, we just kept searching and searching. We were unsettled, and we knew that we didn't really have it, the truth yet. And so, again, I want to share this because the people in your lives who might put up a certain kind of front or even try to educate you and help you to have a freer life than you're having as a Christian, you have to understand that whatever they're presenting to you is not true, that the true God has made himself. It says when they knew God. So that's everybody. Every adult on the planet has had a moment in their life where they knew who the true God was. And if they didn't become a Christian in that moment, they had to change in their mind the truth of God into a lie so that they could continue to live and continue down whatever path that their flesh was leading them. So the truth, what I'm trying to say is the truth is on our side, that there's other people out there just like me and my wife who say we have it all together, but secretly we don't, and there's only one thing that is going to satisfy, and that's Jesus. So thank you for having us today, and